those receiving their Bibles today that have said, I decided to read the Bible from cover to cover, and I started with the New Testament, and when I got to chapter 1 and all of the begots and the begots and the begots, I decided to lose interest. One of the things that we're going to find out today in this first chapter of Matthew is that this is a sermon in itself. And so one of the things you're going to find is that in this list, which actually goes along with the passage in Ruth, is you've got some people that are wonderful. And so, in fact, I'm going to hold up a sign that just says cheer. And so when I hold up this sign, I want you to cheer. And then you also have some people in this list that are a bit sketchy, because we all have that in our family tree. And so when we come up to one of those sketchy people in Jesus' lineage, I'm going to hold up this and you say boo. And then we have a whole bunch of people that we have no idea. I mean, their name comes in and out, and we don't even know who they are, or this is the only recording. So when I hold up this, I want you to go, huh. All right, so let's try that. Okay, all right, and I've asked, because we're getting even with Max, we've asked Max to illustrate this passage here.
This is the list of the ancestors of Jesus Christ. A descendant of David, who was a descendant of Abraham. Abraham was the father of Isaac, who was the father of Jacob, the man who stole his brother's birthright. And Jacob was the father of Judah and his brothers who sold Joseph into slavery. And Judah was the father of Perez, and Zerah, and Tamar, and Perez, and the father of Hezron, and Hezron, the father of Ram, and Ram, the father of Amminadab. And Amminadab was the father of Nahshon, who was the father of Solomon, who was the father of Boaz, and Rahab, the prostitute. And Obed was the father of Jesse, who was the father of David the king. And David was the father of Solomon by the wife of Uriah, whom he had murdered. And Solomon was the father of Rehoboam, a good king, but one who disobeyed God for several years. And Rehoboam was the father of Abijah, who had 14 wives. We're only halfway through this. And Abijah was the father of Asa, the good king, but later disobeyed God and died of gangrene of the feet. That had to hurt. Asa was the father of Jehoshaphat, a king who ruled wisely most of the time. Jehoshaphat was the father of Joram, the father of Uzziah, whose pride caused his downfall. But Uzziah was the father of Jotham, a very good king in every way. And Jotham was the father of Ahaz, a very bad king in every way. And Ahaz was the father of Hezekiah, who cleansed the temple and reestablished the kingdom. Hezekiah was the father of Manasseh, who ruled for 55 years, but who was evil for most of that time. Manasseh was the father of Josiah, who did right in the eyes of the Lord. Josiah was the father of Jeconiah. Yeah, that's right. Who was the father of, it gets better, Shealtiel, the father of Zorobabel, a governor of the people who was chosen by God. And Zorobabel was the father of Abiud, who was the father of Eliakim, the father of Azor, the father of Zadok, the father of Achim, the father of Eliud, the father of Eleazar, the father of Matan, and the father of Jacob, not the one we spoke of earlier, however. And that Jacob was the father of Joseph the carpenter, who was the husband of the Virgin Mary, of whom was born Jesus, whom we call Lord of Lords and King of Kings, the Christ. And so ends our reading of the day, and may God add his blessing to this list of unique names.
There was a young man who was doing quite well in school. In fact, all of his subjects he was doing very well in, except for one, math. And the boy continued to have problems despite everything that his parents would do. They encouraged him, they gave him support, they even hired a tutor. So they finally decided to send him off to a new school, a Catholic school. And the change was remarkable. Every night he would come home, he would go straight to his room, and he'd studied until bedtime. And even after the semester was over and he got an A+ in math, he continued to study as hard as he could. And as the parents approached him and they asked him, what's the difference here? Was it the curriculum? Was it the teachers? Was it your peers? Oh no, said the boy. I knew they meant business from the first day when I saw that guy nailed to the plus sign. Today we conclude our sermon series on this fascinating book, the book of Ruth. And by the time we're done today, some of our dearest held beliefs will probably be challenged. I'm sensing that some of you probably will not like my message. And I'm guessing with what Ruth will say today will shock the rest of you. Because this is a book that means business. It's more than just a love story. It's more than just a narrative about grief and loss and hunger and pain. This is a popular story because we gain a glimpse of the very history of the greatest king in all of Israel, King David. As the title points out from today's sermon, Ruth is the great-grandmother of King David. As you might imagine, the story was quite popular because people wanted to hear about their king, their beloved king. I mean, today these origin stories are still popular. My wife likes to watch these documentaries on PBS and the History Channel. There's one that she likes called Finding Your Roots. And in it is you have these famous people, and you get to watch them as they learn about their grandparents and their great-grandparents and their ancestors. And you realize as these people, even though they have absolutely beautiful DNA, are just like us. They're learning about their history and their heritage and where they came from. And it's just like the origin story of King David. People wanted to know. And so they told and retold and shared this story of Ruth. So who was Ruth? Let's do a little recap here. In chapter 1, we learn that she is the daughter-in-law to Naomi. And as the story develops, they're off in Moab. Now this is important here because Moab is a neighbor to Israel. And Moab is a very poor country, and more importantly that, Moab and Israel, they hate each other. The Moabites and the Israelites, they hate each other, but there's a little famine going on, and so Naomi's family, they decide to go over to Moab, and when they're over in Moab, the two sons get married, and they marry these Moabites. And while they're there, something happens. The husband and the two sons die, leaving Naomi just with two daughter-in-laws, both Moabites. And Naomi decides to go back to Israel. Ruth comes along with her. Now, as we learned in that first chapter, Ruth could have stayed home. But she didn't. She went with her mother-in-law. And she becomes the foreigner in Israel. Chapter 2. Ruth and Naomi are hungry. And Naomi is grieving too much. And so Ruth takes the initiative to go and find food. And as she's going to find food, she gets the attention of Boaz. And Boaz has recognized everything that Naomi has done. Or excuse me, everything that Ruth has done for her mother-in-law. Despite the fact that Ruth is a foreigner, he protects her, he feeds her, he keeps an eye on her. Now, last week in chapter 3, we learned that things change. We go from this sense of bleakness for Naomi and Ruth, where they're in grief and they're hungry, to this promise of the future. And then we also learned that Boaz and Ruth, they kind of like each other. And then some interesting shenanigans on the threshing room floor. Boaz promises to marry Ruth. Now there's one problem. There's one relative in the way, standing in the way for these two to get married, much like Iowa is for Nebraska. So I get a laughter on that. So. Now, are you going to be reading to us Ruth chapter 4? Okay. At this point, we've already covered chapter 3. Now we're going to have Ruth chapter 4.
Boaz went to the meeting place at the town gate and sat there. Then Elimelech's nearest relative, the man whom Boaz had mentioned, came by, and Boaz called to him, "Come over here, my friend, and sit down." So he went over and sat down. Then Boaz got 10 of the leaders of the town and asked them to sit down there too. When they were seated, he said to his relative, "Now that Naomi has come back from Moab, she wants to sell the field that belonged to our relative Elimelech, and I think you ought to know about it. Now then, if you want it, buy it in the presence of these men sitting here. But if you don't want it, say so, because the right to buy it belongs first to you and then to me." The man said, "I will buy it." Boaz said, "Very well. If you buy the field from Naomi, then you are also buying Ruth, the Moabite widow, so that the field will stay in the dead man's family." The man answered, "In that case, I will give up my right to buy the field, because it would mean that my own children would not inherit it. You buy it, I would rather not." Now in those days, to settle a sale or an exchange of property, it was the custom for the seller to take off his sandal and give it to the buyer. In this way, the Israelites showed that the matter was settled. So when the man said to Boaz, "You buy it," he took off his sandal and gave it to Boaz. Then Boaz said to the leaders and all the others there, "You are all witnesses today that I have bought from Naomi everything that belonged to Elimelech, and to his sons Chilion and Mahlon. In addition, Ruth, the Moabite, Mahlon's widow, becomes my wife. This will keep the property in the dead man's family, and his family line will continue among his people and in his hometown. You are witnesses to this today." The leaders and the others said, "Yes, we are witnesses. May the Lord make your wife become like Rachel and Leah, who bore many children to Jacob. May you become rich in the clan of Ephraim and famous in Bethlehem. May the children that the Lord will give you by this young woman make your family like the family of Perez, the son of Judah, and Tamar." So Boaz took Ruth home as his wife. The Lord blessed her, and she became pregnant and had a son. The women said to Naomi, "Praise the Lord, he has given you a grandson today to take care of you. May the boy become famous in Israel. Your daughter-in-law loves you and has done more for you than 7 sons. And now she has given you a grandson who will bring you new life to you and give you security in your old age." Naomi took the child, held him close, and took care of him. The women of the neighborhood named the boy Obed. They told everyone, "A son has been born to Naomi." Obed became the father of Jesse, who was the father of David. This is the family line from Perez to David: Perez, Hezron, Ram, Amminadab. I don't have my cheat sheet, I'm sorry. Nashon, Salmon, Boaz, Obed, Jesse, and David.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Max. Appreciate it. Some of you probably heard this story about this guy that goes to this bar, and he's just sitting there for about a half an hour staring at his drink. And this big troublemaking truck driver comes up and kind of muscles his way through and grabs the guy's drink, and he downs it. And with that, the guy at the bar just begins to cry. "Oh, come on, man," says the truck driver. "I was just joking. Here, I'll buy you another drink. I hate to see a grown man cry." And the man says, no, that's not it. This morning I missed my alarm and I was late to work. And when I got to work, my boss fired me. And when I packed up my belongings and went out to the car, my car was stolen. And when I got into the cab to get a ride home, the cab driver, after he dropped me off, sped off, and he had my phone and he had my wallet and my credit cards and all my cash with me. And I get into my house and my wife kicks me out of the house. And then I come to this bar and I'm getting ready to drink, and you come up and you drink my poison. What happens when you hear something that shocks you? Something that changes the way you see the world forever. In a nutshell, that is what takes place in the book of Ruth. The source of this shock, well, it's that illustration that Max and I had for you from Matthew. Because if you notice, the reading from the last of Ruth matches Matthew 1. This is a family tree. It's a family tree that is a scandal. Because the greatest king of all of Israel is descendant of a Moabite. Ruth, the Moabite, is the great-grandmother of King David. And the shocker here is that scholars say that at that time when Ruth was becoming popular, it was the same time that Ezra was being written. Now, we've read to you from Ruth, and you've heard all 4 chapters of Ruth. I want you to keep that in mind when you turn to chapter 10 of Ezra. Now, if you would like, go ahead. You've got your pew Bibles with you. I didn't give you the page numbers because we've actually have several different versions of the pew Bibles in front of you. But if you want Ezra and Nehemiah, just turn to Ezra 10. You will actually see the words right up here. But if you want to follow along, you can. Ezra 10. Shechaniah, son of Jehiel, of the descendants of Elam, addressed Ezra, saying, we have broken faith with our God and have married foreign women from the peoples of the land. But even now there is hope for Israel in spite of this. So now let us make a covenant with our God to send away all of these wives and their children, according to the counsel of my Lord and of those who tremble at the commandment of our God. And let it be done according to the law. Then we're going to skip ahead to verse 10. Then Ezra the priest stood up and said to them, you have trespassed and married foreign women, and so increased the guilt of Israel. Now make confession to the Lord, the God of your ancestors, and do his will. Separate yourselves from the peoples of the land and from the foreign wives. Then all the assembly answered with a loud voice, it is so. We must do as you have said. Let our officials represent the whole assembly, and let all in our towns who have taken foreign wives come at appointed times, and with them the elders and judges of every town, until the fierce wrath of God on this account is averted from us. Now I'm not going to read to you verses 18 through 43. But if you want, you can see the list. This is a list published for all to read and to see, everyone that married a foreign wife. And then the last verse of Ezra says, all these had married foreign women, and they sent them away with their children. Let me give you a little background of what's taking place here. Here's the background. Okay, this is long after King David. After King David, he has a son named Solomon, and Israel is this mighty kingdom. In fact, the borders of Israel are so large that they've never been matched at that time. But after Solomon dies, the kingdom gets broken into 2 kingdoms, Israel in the north and Judah in the south. As you might imagine, as you illustrated here, you had some good kings and you had some bad kings. And so one of the things that takes place is that these foreign powers, they come and they eventually defeat first Israel and then they defeat Judah. Well, in one of those defeats, what takes place is the Israelites are sent off into exile. They're defeated by the Babylonians. And so they go all the way over to Babylon, which is now Iraq. And so they're sitting over there in Iraq, and you have these exiles. But here's the problem. You have some Israelites that are still there. They didn't go off into exile. But when the people over in exile, they decide they're going to keep their religion pure. They're not going to marry the foreigners. They're going to make sure that everything is the way it is, because just in case there's that hope that we're going to get sent back to Israel. But the people that are in Israel, they don't have this purity. They're just living. They fall in love They're neighbors. They might be foreigners. There might be people living right next to them. They fall in love. They have children. They have grandchildren. They're working the land. Do you see the tension there? And then what takes place is when they come out of exile. These people come out of exile and they have had this sense of purity. I mean, they did not marry foreign wives. And they come in and they look at these Israelites and they've married foreigners. They have married foreign women, and that's just not fair. That cannot happen. And so this is the context of the book of Ruth. I want you to think about that as I tell this story. There's a man that is driving down a mountain road. As he's driving up a mountain road, and as he's driving along, this convertible passes by him, and in driving this convertible was a beautiful woman. And it just caught his eye, and he just stared at this beautiful woman. And as she is going along and she notices that this guy is staring at her, she kind of looks at this guy and she yells out the window, "Pig!" And the guy is kind of offended by that. I mean, he didn't mean anything by looking. I mean, she's a beautiful woman. And with that, he's so offended, he begins to think of his own wife. He thinks about how beautiful she is and how much he loved her. And as he's continuing to drive around that corner, he runs into a pig. You've heard the story already. You see, just like that story, Ezra gets us thinking in one direction. And then Ruth has to remind us of what the Bible is all about. You see, this is a time of xenophobia. This is a time of distrust and hatred of foreigners. This is a time when the people are thinking inward and they're scared of who and what is out there. And Ruth reminds everybody of the bigger picture. The world is not black and white. Labels are for jars, not for people. You ever heard that? Ruth reminds us of what is good in the Bible. But this story shows us that people can interpret the Bible and twist it in ugly ways. I shared with you my experience with Dr. Harold Washington. He was my professor of Hebrew Bible there in Kansas City when I was going to seminary down there. And I've told you that he is considered an expert on the Egyptian influence in the Bible. So you might imagine he travels widely. But one of the things that takes place is his home base has always been Kansas City. He's been there for some 30 years. But when you hear his southern drawl, you know that he is not from Kansas City. In fact, Dr. Harold Washington is from the deep south, Alabama. And one of the things that he would tell us in class is back in his home, in his neck of the woods, is that the book of Ezra, to this day, the book of Ezra, to this day, is used by people in the pulpit. It's used to keep the races separate. He says to this day in the pulpit, whenever a black man and a white woman or someone that's black and white want to get married or they're dating, the book of Ezra comes out and is quoted. He says that this pulpit, which is supposed to be the authority by God, tells the flocks that the races are not to intermix. And in this very context, my professor, Dr. Harold Washington, tells us the story of Ruth. Because he says that in Israel and in the deep south, there is a debate, there's a struggle, there's a fight on the very identity. Who is an Israelite? Who is a true American? Who is a true follower of God? I have a couple of show and tell items here for you. This right here is a family tree that I did when I was in high school. I'm not going to unroll it for you. It's in pretty bad shape, but won a blue ribbon at the state fair, so I'm very proud of that. And then this also show here, this is my dad's book. And so if you're interested, my dad's still selling this on eBay. I'm not selling it for him, but you know, come to think of it, but there's some stories there. And like so many stories that we find in this family tree and in that book is some skeletons. Some skeletons that you like to keep in the closet. For example, in these stories, I've got relatives that own slaves. I also have another story of a relative that had an extramarital affair. Kept it quiet his entire life until at his death, and as the family was sitting there at the committal, sitting around, someone said, you know, I think there's an extra cousin there. And all it took was some snooping cousins to find out that yes, there's an extra cousin out there. Probably the saddest story out there is one of my ancestors. She had a baby. The baby lived about a day or two, and after the baby died, was buried on the farm. She wasn't allowed to tell anybody about it. But whenever she could steal herself away, she would go down and visit her grave. No one knew about it until this ancestor of mine had dementia. And she began to talk about this little baby. And everyone kind of questioning about it. And then finally the answer came out, and we found out that my grandmother had a sister. You know, we all have stories like this. Some of them are buried so deep that they may never come out. But guess what? This is who we are. We are human. Last week we talked about Boaz and Ruth, a very unusual story to read in the Bible. A lot of shenanigans going on there. But one of the things that we learned there is that the Bible mirrors life. And in a time when Israel is trying to define itself, guess what happened? They forgot who they are. They forgot where they came from. They missed the boat on their own heritage. And they left out a vital story. The great-grandmother of the greatest king of Israel was a foreigner. And as we learned, had some fantastic character traits that taught all the people of Israel. As I said, the Bible mirrors life. Us humans are always doing human things. We like to keep our skeletons hidden in the past. We forget about our role as the people of God. We got our life through prejudice and hatred and mistrust, and we're often turning ourselves away from our role as God's example for people in the world. But as I said, the Bible mirrors life. And thank God for that. For Ruth, the story of Ruth reminds us of an important lesson. We humans do human stuff, but this is not the way of God. God's principles are found in the stories like the great-grandmother of King David, who taught us something. And I'm here to tell you that I'll match up that Bible story with any story if someone says that we should be guided by hate and prejudice. One of my favorite books and favorite movie was The Mutiny on the Bounty. Familiar with this story? There's a mutiny that takes place on this boat. And so these individuals, these mutinous individuals, they get some people from Tahiti, and they end up at an island called Pitcairn. And as they're there, they decide to create their own society away from the very tyranny that they just escaped from. But the problem was, 9 years after they settled on Pitcairn Island, their small community had been destroyed by jealousy, alcohol, sex, and violence. There were only 12. The statistics are quite crippling. 12 murders, a suspicious accidental death, 1 suicide, possibly of Fletcher Christian, who was the one that led the mutiny. And only 1 man from the Bounty, a scoundrel by the name of John Adams, survived. Well, one day Adams was rummaging around a storage chest that was salvaged from the ship and discovered a copy of the Bible. He began reading it, and what happened next was remarkable. He started referring to himself as Jesus Christians, in contrast with the Fletcher Christians. He turned away from his old violent ways and began teaching the remaining Pitcairners the Christian faith and practice. As you might imagine, the island society was transformed. R.B. Nicholson, who actually wrote a book called The Pitcairners, says about the islanders, after being involved in brawls, mutiny, murders, immorality, and drunkenness, the last surviving mutineer turned to religion, and this undoubtedly saved the island community from complete disintegration. The story of Ruth teaches us that despite our differences, despite how we treat each other, despite wanting to use Scripture to lift our own prejudices, despite our human flaws, God says, not so fast. There's a better way. Even a foreigner, the hated Moabite, can teach the people of God a thing or two. She is not only the great-grandmother of King David, she is teaching us to be the people of God. The story of Ruth is that life is not so black and white. So trust in God and God's principles so that we can be saved and transform our society. Amen. This time I'm going to ask our usher